The morning started like any other, coffee brewing, sunlight streaming through the curtains, and my husband already gone for work. But when I heard the knock at the back door, everything changed. Standing there was a stranger with a dangerous smile and eyes that seemed to see through me. I should have turned him away, but I didn't. And now, I can't stop thinking about the secret we've created. I wasn't always the kind of woman who kept secrets. My life was simple, predictable even, a suburban home with a white picket fence, a hard-working husband, and a loyal golden retriever, Danny. On the surface, I had everything anyone could ask for. But beneath that picture-perfect life, something had been missing for years. A hollow ache that I couldn't name, a quiet desperation that followed me from room to room. Ron, my husband, was a good man. Reliable, steady, and dependable. He worked hard to provide for us, leaving early in the mornings and coming home just in time for dinner. But somewhere along the way, we had stopped being a team. Our conversations were brief, practical, and devoid of the laughter and intimacy we once shared. I told myself it was normal. All marriages change over time, don't they? My days were filled with routines, cleaning the house, tending to my garden, and playing with Danny in the backyard. He was my constant companion, his wagging tail and eager eyes a reminder of simpler joys. But even Danny couldn't fill the void. Loneliness had settled into my bones, a quiet passenger in my life. I tried to ignore it, but it lingered in every corner of my home, a shadow I couldn't escape. It was during one of those ordinary mornings, while pruning roses in the garden, that everything began to unravel. The knock at the back door startled me. I wasn't expecting anyone, but when I opened the door, I found a man standing there, a stranger with a rugged charm and a disarming smile. He introduced himself as Mark, an old friend of Ron's, passing through town. I should have been wary, cautious even. But instead, I invited him in. Mark was everything Ron wasn't. Charismatic, adventurous, and attentive in a way that made me feel seen for the first time in years. Over coffee, we talked about his travels, his stories, and eventually, about me. I told him things I hadn't told anyone, not even Ron. His presence was exhilarating, but it also stirred something dangerous within me. That morning changed everything, setting in motion events I couldn't control, no matter how hard I tried. After Mark's visit, the air in the house felt heavier, charged with an energy I couldn't shake. I tried to carry on with my usual routine, pruning the garden, walking Danny, and preparing dinner for Ron, but everything felt different. My thoughts drifted constantly to Mark, to the way his hand had lingered near mine, to the way his voice had made me feel alive in a way I hadn't felt in years. Ron didn't notice the change in me, at least not at first. He was as predictable as ever, coming home late and collapsing into bed without much more than a "How was your day?" But I noticed. I noticed how I stiffened when he kissed me on the cheek, how I found excuses to stay up late after he'd gone to sleep, replaying every detail of my conversation with Mark. Then, the phone calls started. They were infrequent at first, a single ring in the middle of the day, then silence when I picked up. I told myself it was nothing, probably a wrong number. But as the days passed, the calls became more frequent, and a creeping unease settled in. On one occasion, I thought I heard Mark's voice on the other end, low and hesitant. I hung up quickly, my heart racing, unsure whether I was more afraid or exhilarated. Danny, my ever-loyal companion, seemed to sense my unease. He stayed closer to me, his warm gaze following me as if he were trying to read my thoughts. I found solace in his presence, but even that wasn't enough to quiet the storm growing inside me. The more I tried to suppress my thoughts about Mark, the more they consumed me. One evening, as I set the table for dinner, Ron called to say he'd be working late again. Relief washed over me, relief that I wouldn't have to sit across from him and pretend everything was fine. But my relief was short-lived. As I placed the last plate on the table, I glanced out the window and froze. Mark was standing across the street, his hands shoved into his jacket pockets, watching my house. My first instinct was to close the curtains, to shut him out. But I didn't. Instead, I stood there, staring back at him, my heart pounding in my chest. He didn't move, didn't wave or smile. He just stood there, his presence both unnerving and magnetic. Finally, he turned and walked away, disappearing into the shadows as quickly as he'd appeared. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, my mind racing with questions. Why had Mark come back? What did he want from me? And why couldn't I stop thinking about him? I tried to convince myself that it was nothing, that I was imagining things, but the truth was impossible to ignore. Mark's presence had awakened something in me, something I wasn't sure I could control. The next day, I avoided the garden, afraid that I might see him again. But the tension didn't ease. Every creak of the house, every bark from Danny, made my pulse quicken. By the time Ron came home that evening, I was a bundle of nerves. He noticed, of course. "You've been quiet lately," he said as we ate dinner. His tone was casual, but his eyes lingered on me a moment too long. "I've just been tired," I replied quickly, forcing a smile. "Probably all the gardening." He nodded, accepting my excuse, but I could see the flicker of doubt in his eyes. For the first time in years, I realized that Ron might be paying closer attention than I thought. The following morning, I decided to take Danny for a long walk, hoping the fresh air would clear my mind. But as I rounded the corner of my street, I saw him again, Mark, leaning against his car, waiting. He smiled when our eyes met, a slow, deliberate smile that sent a shiver down my spine. "Morning, Karen," he said, his voice as smooth as I remembered. I was hoping we could talk. My throat went dry, and for a moment, I considered walking away, pretending I hadn't seen him. But I didn't. Instead, I took a step closer, the weight of my choices pressing down on me. "What are you doing here, Mark?" I asked, my voice barely steady. His smile faded, replaced by something darker. "I couldn't stop thinking about you." The words hung in the air between us, impossible to take back. And in that moment, I knew, this was no longer something I could ignore. Whatever had started that day in my kitchen was far from over, and the consequences were already spiraling out of my control. Mark's words echoed in my mind long after I walked away from him that morning. "I couldn't stop thinking about you." They were a confession, a crack in the carefully constructed facade of my life. But they were also an invitation, one I knew I should refuse but couldn't bring myself to. The line I thought I'd never cross was closer now, and the more I tried to retreat, the more it pulled me in. I tried to lose myself in the routine of my day, but nothing felt normal anymore. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw his face. Every time I heard a car outside, my heart skipped a beat, wondering if it was him. By the time evening rolled around, the tension was unbearable. Ron was late again, his absence both a relief and a reminder of how distant we had become. I sat in the living room, the television flickering in the background, when the doorbell rang. My pulse quickened. For a moment, I hoped it was a neighbor, maybe a delivery. But when I opened the door, Mark was standing there. "I know I shouldn't be here," he said, his voice low and urgent. "But I had to see you." I should have shut the door, should have told him to leave. But instead, I stepped aside, letting him in. The moment the door closed behind him, the air between us felt charged, alive with an energy I hadn't felt in years. "Mark, this is a bad idea," I said, though my voice lacked conviction. He stepped closer, his eyes searching mine. "Is it?" "Because I don't think it is." The words hung in the air, daring me to deny the connection between us. But I couldn't. Every part of me screamed that this was wrong, but my body betrayed me, leaning into the pull of his presence. Before I could stop myself, I spoke. "What do you want from me?" His answer was immediate, raw. "You. I want you, Karen." The distance between us vanished. His hands found my face, his touch both hesitant and electric. I froze, torn between the life I knew and the fire he ignited in me. When his lips met mine, it wasn't gentle. It was desperate, a collision of everything we had been holding back. For a moment, the world disappeared. The guilt, the fear, the consequences, they all melted away in the heat of his kiss. His hands moved to my waist, pulling me closer, and I felt myself surrendering to something I couldn't control. It was intoxicating, terrifying, and utterly wrong. "I can't do this," I whispered, breaking away. My chest heaved as I tried to catch my breath, my thoughts a chaotic mess. "You already are," he replied, his voice soft but unrelenting. I turned away, my fingers trembling as I pressed them to my lips. Ron. If he finds out. Mark's expression softened, but his determination didn't waver. He doesn't have to. This can stay between us. His words should have repelled me, but instead, they tempted me. The promise of secrecy, of something that was just mine, was too alluring to ignore. For years, I had been drowning in routine, in loneliness. And now, here was Mark, offering me a lifeline, no matter how dangerous it was. I need time to think, I said, my voice shaky but firm. You need to go. He nodded, though I could see the reluctance in his eyes. I'll wait for you, Karen. As long as it takes. When he left, the silence in the house felt deafening. I stood there for what felt like hours, staring at the door, my thoughts a whirlwind of guilt and longing. Danny trotted into the room, his wagging tail a stark contrast to the turmoil inside me. I knelt beside him, burying my face in his fur, hoping the comfort of his presence could drown out the chaos in my mind. But the days that followed only made things worse. Mark's absence should have been a relief, but it wasn't. I found myself glancing out the window, hoping to catch a glimpse of him. Every time my phone buzzed, my heart leapt, only to sink when it wasn't him. I was unraveling, and I didn't know how to stop it. One evening, as I sat in the garden watching the sun set, my phone buzzed with a text. I can't stop thinking about you. I need to see you. It was from Mark. My hands trembled as I stared at the message, torn between deleting it and replying. Before I could decide, another text came through. I'll be at the park tomorrow morning. If you want to talk, you know where to find me. I didn't respond, but I couldn't ignore the pull. The next morning, I found myself at the park, my heart racing as I spotted him waiting near the fountain. He smiled when he saw me, the kind of smile that made me forget why I had come to tell him we couldn't do this. Karen, he said, his voice warm and inviting. I shouldn't be here, I replied, but I stayed anyway. We talked for hours, sharing secrets we had no business sharing. When he reached for my hand, I didn't pull away. And when he leaned in to kiss me again, I let him. In that moment, I knew I had crossed a line I couldn't uncross. The question was no longer if I would pay for my choices, but when. The next few weeks became a tangled web of lies and stolen moments. Mark and I had crossed a boundary I never thought I would. What began as a spark had turned into a fire I couldn't contain. Every touch, every whispered word felt like an escape from the life I'd convinced myself was enough. But with every moment I spent with him, the walls of my carefully constructed world began to close in. Ron was no fool. He had always been perceptive, even if our connection had dulled over the years. He noticed the subtle shifts, the way I avoided his touch, the way my phone seemed glued to my hand, the way I left the house for errands more often than usual. He didn't say anything at first, but his silence was heavy, filled with questions I wasn't ready to answer. One evening, as I was preparing dinner, Ron entered the kitchen. His expression was unreadable, but his voice was calm, a dangerous kind of calm that sent a chill down my spine. Karen, he said, his eyes locking onto mine. Is there something you need to tell me? The knife in my hand froze mid-chop. What do you mean? I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. He crossed his arms, leaning against the counter. You've been different lately. Distracted. Distant. And don't think I haven't noticed the texts you're trying to hide. My heart raced as panic clawed at my throat. Ron, I don't know what you're talking about. Don't lie to me, he said, his voice rising slightly. I saw him. The man from the park. You think I don't notice when you disappear for hours? When you come home with that look on your face? The air between us felt suffocating. I wanted to deny it, to tell him he was imagining things, but the look in his eyes told me he wouldn't believe me. He had already seen too much. I can explain, I started, but my voice faltered. What could I possibly say to make this right? Ron's expression darkened, his fists clenching at his sides. Explain what, Karen? That you've been sneaking around behind my back. That you've been with him. The accusation hit like a slap, and tears sprang to my eyes. It's not what you think, I said weakly. Then what is it? He demanded. Because from where I'm standing, it looks like you've thrown away everything we've built for some fling with a stranger." "It wasn't like that," I whispered, my voice barely audible. "I was lonely, Ron. I felt invisible, and he made me feel alive." Ron's face contorted with a mix of anger and hurt. "Alive? And what about me, Karen? What about us? Were we not enough for you?" His words cut deep, and I felt the weight of my choices pressing down on me. "I don't know what I was thinking," I admitted, tears streaming down my face. "I wasn't trying to hurt you." "Well, you did," he said coldly. "And now I'm left wondering if there's anything left to save." The room fell into a tense silence, broken only by the faint sound of Danny's claws clicking against the floor as he wandered into the kitchen. He looked up at us, his innocent eyes a stark contrast to the turmoil in the room. Ron shook his head, his voice trembling. "I need time, Karen. I can't even look at you right now." He left without another word, the sound of the front door slamming echoing through the house. I stood there, numb, the reality of what I'd done crashing down around me. The life I'd built with Ron, the trust we'd shared, it was all hanging by a thread, and I had no idea how to fix it. The next day, I didn't hear from Ron. He didn't answer my calls or texts, and the silence was deafening. Mark tried reaching out, but I ignored him. I needed space, needed to figure out what I wanted, what I could salvage from the wreckage of my choices. But life had other plans. That evening, as I sat in the living room with Danny at my feet, the doorbell rang. My heart sank as I opened the door to find Mark standing there. His expression was a mixture of concern and determination. "We need to talk," he said. "Not now," I replied, glancing nervously over my shoulder. "Ron could be back any minute." "I don't care," Mark said firmly. "I care about you, Karen. And I'm not going to let you deal with this alone." Before I could respond, headlights swept across the living room, and the sound of a car door slamming made my blood run cold. Ron was home. "What the hell is this?" Ron's voice boomed as he stepped inside, his eyes darting between me and Mark. "This isn't what it looks like," I stammered, panic rising in my chest. Ron's gaze hardened as he turned to Mark. "You've got a lot of nerve showing up here." "I'm not here to cause trouble," Mark said evenly. "I just wanted to talk." "Talk?" Ron spat. "You think you can just waltz into my house after sneaking around with my wife?" "Ron, please," I interjected, stepping between them. "This is my fault, not his." "That's the first honest thing you've said," Ron snapped, his voice dripping with bitterness. "But that doesn't change what's happened." The confrontation spiraled into chaos, the tension in the room thick enough to cut with a knife. Mark eventually left, knowing his presence was only making things worse. But the damage was done. Ron and I sat in silence after he was gone, the weight of everything unsaid filling the space between us. "I don't know if I can forgive you," Ron said finally, his voice raw with emotion. "But I don't want to make any decisions tonight." I nodded, tears streaming down my face. "I understand." As Ron retreated to the guest room, I was left alone with my thoughts. The secrets I'd kept, the choices I'd made, they had all led to this moment. The life I'd known was shattered, and I didn't know if it could ever be pieced back together. But one thing was certain, the truth was out, and there was no going back. The days that followed were heavy with silence. Ron avoided me, retreating to the guest room at night and barely speaking to me during the day. The tension in the house was suffocating, every unspoken word a reminder of the fragile state of our marriage. I knew I couldn't push him for answers, couldn't ask for forgiveness on my timeline. This was a wound only time could begin to heal, if it could heal at all. Mark called and texted repeatedly, but I ignored him. Seeing him again, letting him back into my life, would only make things worse. Whatever connection we had, whatever fleeting escape he had offered, was now tainted by the destruction it had caused. I couldn't afford to let him be a part of my life anymore, not if I wanted to save what little was left of my marriage. Ron's silence, however, wasn't as impenetrable as I feared. Late one evening, I heard him pacing in the living room. I crept down the stairs, finding him staring at the photographs on the mantel, the memories of the life we had built together. His shoulders sagged, and for the first time in days, I saw the man I had once fallen in love with, struggling beneath the weight of my betrayal. "Ron," I said softly, my voice barely audible. He turned to look at me, his eyes tired and red-rimmed. "Why, Karen?" he asked, his voice breaking. "Why him? Why any of it?" The question hit like a punch to the gut. I had spent countless nights asking myself the same thing, searching for answers I wasn't sure I had. "I don't know," I admitted, tears streaming down my face. I was lonely. I felt invisible, like I didn't matter to you anymore. Ron's jaw tightened, but he didn't interrupt. I pressed on, knowing this might be my only chance to explain. "I know that's not an excuse. What I did was selfish, and it was wrong. But I was so desperate to feel something, anything, that I let myself believe it didn't matter who got hurt." "It mattered to me," Ron said, his voice low and raw. "You mattered to me." His words shattered the last bit of composure I had. I sank into the armchair, sobbing into my hands. "I know I don't deserve it, but I want to fix this," I said between gasps. "I'll do whatever it takes, Ron. I'll go to therapy. I'll leave this house if you want me to. Just, please don't give up on us." Ron stood silently for what felt like an eternity. Then, finally, he sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I don't know if I can forgive you, Karen. Not yet. But I'm willing to try, if only because I don't want to throw away everything we've built without fighting for it." His words were cautious, guarded, but they were more than I deserved. It was a glimmer of hope in the wreckage of my mistakes. "Thank you," I whispered, my voice trembling. The days that followed were some of the hardest of my life. We began therapy together, sitting across from a calm, composed counselor who guided us through the tangled mess of our emotions. The sessions were brutal, peeling back layers of resentment and pain that had been buried for years. Ron admitted to feeling neglected, to believing that his role as provider was enough to show me he cared. I confessed to feeling trapped, to longing for the connection we had lost somewhere along the way. It wasn't easy. There were days when the silence between us felt unbearable, when I thought Ron would pack his bags and leave for good. But there were also moments of hope, moments when we laughed, however briefly, or shared a quiet dinner without the weight of our mistakes looming over us. Mark, thankfully, stayed away. I blocked his number, deleted his texts, and avoided the places where I thought I might run into him. He was a chapter of my life I needed to close, a reminder of the damage I had caused. There were nights when I missed the way he had made me feel, wanted, alive, but I knew that kind of escape was fleeting. What I needed now was something real, something worth rebuilding. Ron and I took small steps toward mending our relationship. We started spending more time together, rediscovering the things that had drawn us to each other in the first place. Danny, our ever-loyal golden retriever, became a silent witness to our journey, his wagging tail and eager eyes a reminder that some things in life were still pure and good. One evening, as we sat together in the garden, Ron reached for my hand. It was a simple gesture, but it spoke volumes. "We've got a long way to go," he said quietly, "but I think we can get there." I nodded, tears welling in my eyes. "I'll do whatever it takes." The path forward wasn't easy, and it wasn't guaranteed. But for the first time in weeks, I felt a sense of hope, a belief that we could find our way back to each other, one step at a time. Months passed, and while life didn't return to what it once was, it began to feel like something new, something real. Ron and I were learning how to communicate again, peeling back layers of hurt and rebuilding a foundation we had once taken for granted. It wasn't perfect, and there were moments of doubt, but we kept showing up, day after day, for ourselves and for each other. Therapy became a cornerstone of our healing. Our counselor helped us confront the deeper issues that had led us to this point: my feelings of invisibility, Ron's tendency to equate providing with affection, and the routines that had quietly eroded our connection over the years. It was hard work, often uncomfortable, but it forced us to see each other not as the people we had become but as the people we could be again. One session, Ron looked at me with an expression I hadn't seen in years: vulnerability. "I thought I was doing everything right, Karen," he said, his voice breaking. "I thought that if I worked hard enough, provided enough, you'd feel loved. But I see now that I was wrong. I stopped showing you the things that matter." His words stayed with me, long after the session ended. They were a reminder that love isn't static, it requires constant care, attention, and effort. And I realized that I, too, had failed to nurture the bond we once shared, letting resentment and loneliness fester instead of reaching out to him. As the weeks turned into months, the cracks in our marriage began to heal, not by pretending they hadn't existed but by addressing them head-on. We made changes, both big and small. We started cooking dinner together instead of eating in silence. We went on walks in the evenings, talking about our days like we used to. We even planned a weekend getaway, something we hadn't done in years, to reconnect without the distractions of daily life. Mark became a distant memory, a shadow of a choice I would always regret. Blocking him from my life was one of the hardest but most necessary decisions I made. I stopped searching for the thrill he had offered and focused instead on finding joy and meaning in the life I already had. Danny, our golden retriever, remained a constant source of comfort. His wagging tail and playful antics reminded me of the simplicity of unconditional love. He seemed to sense the shift in our home, the tension replaced by something softer, more hopeful. On days when the weight of my mistakes felt unbearable, his quiet companionship was a reminder that forgiveness, though difficult, was possible. One evening, as Ron and I sat on the porch watching the sun set, he reached for my hand. The warmth of his touch felt different now, tentative but genuine, like a new beginning. "Karen," he said, his voice soft, "I think we're going to be okay." Tears welled in my eyes as I nodded. I think so too. The journey wasn't over. There would always be scars, reminders of the choices we had made and the pain we had caused each other. But those scars were also proof of our resilience, of our willingness to fight for something worth saving. If there was one lesson I had learned, it was this: love isn't just about the good times. It's about showing up, even when it's hard. It's about forgiving, not because the pain didn't matter but because the relationship does. It's about choosing each other, every day, despite the flaws and mistakes. For the first time in years, I felt hope, not just for our marriage but for myself. I wasn't the woman I had been before, and I never would be again. But I was stronger, wiser, and more determined to live a life that was honest and true. As the stars began to appear in the sky, Ron squeezed my hand gently. "We'll get through this," he said. And for the first time, I truly believed him. What would you have done in Karen's shoes? Could you rebuild trust after such a betrayal, or is forgiveness a step too far? Share your thoughts in the comments below. I want to hear your perspective. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell for more captivating stories of love, betrayal, and redemption. And stay tuned, because the next story will make you question everything you thought you knew about loyalty.